And hello, everyone. Welcome to OBS Talk Show Presents. I'm Keith Williams, your host. Glad everybody can tune in today. And we are dealing with a very important subject here that I believe that our next guest will be able to shed some light on. And we hope that you stick around and kind of listen to what he has to say. Again, this is a very important topic. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. Jeff Clayton as our guest today. Mr. Clayton, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So first of all, tell everybody who you are and what you do.
My name is Jeff Clayton. I'm the executive director of the American Bail Coalition. So we work on all the issues related to the period between arrest and when hopefully somebody gets out on bail or we go through the criminal justice process.
Um, Jeff, I'm so glad that you have come on here because in America, there seems to be a problem with the cash bail system. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, in fact, I've been working on it for the last 8 years.
So tell us, what is your take on the bail system? And from my understanding that some groups of people are being disproportionate, in that area. And we'll get to that in a minute.
I mean, I think that has been the concern, and we have seen some widespread problems depending on certain jurisdictions. And really, it's just that the number one problem I think that we've seen is that people can't get in front of a judge, and so you have an arbitrary setting of bail by a bail schedule, and somebody could sit there. We've seen cases where people could sit there for 30 to 60 days and not be able to make their arguments. I think the other thing that we've seen that's been a problem is that there's a lot of low-level cases where we were just almost mechanistic. We'd just say, well, it's this low-level crime and this bail, and we wouldn't really look into who the person was and what type of financial assets that they have. And obviously there's been disparities in the bail system and the criminal justice system. I don't think the bail system's immune from that. And so those are the kind of the top three issues that we look at: due process, use of unnecessary bail in low-level crimes, and then what can we do about disparities in the criminal justice system, bail, and in general.
What are some of the problems that you have ran across to in the bail system in America?
Well, I think, when I started as an attorney, I had my first criminal case and I said, what do we do about this bail? And they said they call the bail bondsman. And that's just, there's so much more to it than that. The one thing that I've seen that really disturbs me is this idea that we say, well, Jeff can't afford his bail, so let's trammel Jeff's other liberties, right? Let's say, well, Jeff, we'll put you on home arrest. You can't drink. You're going to have to do all this. We're going to put you on a GPS monitor and all this stuff. So we throw up our hands and say, well, if they're gonna get out of jail, then we need to do all this other stuff to them. And you look at the bail system pre 1980, we didn't really have any of that stuff, and things worked quite well in the bail system long before, we got into this era of mass incarceration.
So what is the correlation between the bail system and mass incarceration? Before you answer that, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the state of Alabama, uh, private prisons are a big business here in the state of Alabama. And so what they're trying to do is that they're trying to, and I'm just going to be real, everybody knows me, to be on these podcasts. I'm real, I'm being real. And I talk about stuff the mainstream media does not want to talk about. And I'm going to be real. Here in the state of Alabama, we are dealing with the fact that not only prisons are a big business, but the state is finding ways to lock up Black people. And what you have is cheap labor, nothing more than modern day slavery, as depicted in Amendment 13 of the US Constitution. Not sure if you're aware of that. Also, too, I want to point out for information purposes that COVID relief money that was given to the states range in the billions. Now, Alabama had received roughly about $2 billion, right? So 400 million of that is supposed to be going to build new prisons. And then the governor of the state is going to contract out, is going to lease these prisons to these corporations that specialize in profit off of incarceration quote. So it's a big business. You got banks such as Regions, Wells Fargo, they're behind all of this. And you have a lot of politicians in the state of Alabama that are being paid these backdoor deals and contracts to keep their mouth shut so they won't go against what the state is trying to do. Now, I throw this out at you today. Now, what does this have to do with the bail system? What does this have to do with criminal justice? I'll tell you why it's important. First of all, you have a lot of people that are, they're being arrested, they're going to jail, they cannot pay their bail. So they're just there for what, 30, 60 days, maybe longer, and wouldn't even know if these individuals are even guilty of a crime. They're just accused of a crime, but yet they have to wait a month or two before they determine whether they're innocent or guilty. Meanwhile, they are in the prison system and the state. I can't say for other states, but I know in Alabama is it's a huge problem when we have that type of situation in which these individuals are being exploited by the criminal justice system. Your thoughts on that?
Well, a couple of things. That's a lot to unpack. The first thing, in terms of mass incarceration in the bail system, what we've seen is the growth in non-monetary conditions. So we're setting people up to fail using supervision by the state. And what that does is reify the criminal industrial complex, right? Because we're saying, well, we'll put you on probation, but we know full well that we're setting you up to fail because we have all these aggressive monitoring techniques. And there's been peer-reviewed academic research that suggests using this in the pretrial, before you're convicted and after, is one of the main drivers that we've seen in mass incarceration. A couple other things I would say is that, in terms of deterring crime, the length of the sentence doesn't correlate generally. So it doesn't matter if you get busted, if you spend 2 years or 8 years or 10 years. It's just that swiftness of punishment, certainty of getting caught is what deters crime, not the length of the sentence. And so what we've done is we focus too much on, 2 to 5 versus 1, trying to make sure we have deterrence, and 2, trying to rehabilitate the person. Now, in terms of the private prison stuff, I think when you look at the criminal justice system, and I got a standing ovation for saying this one time, is that the days of offender paid justice must end. We cannot profit off of people's labor. We cannot have a system where we expect the defendants to pay for it. And there's good reasons for that, because it creates bad incentives in the system to build more prisons, to impose too many bails, to do too much supervision, because people are on the take. So I'm with you on that. I think that is the number one thing that we see in the system. Now, obviously, you want to have a more humane prison system than we have now. So I wouldn't say that, if you spend a nickel on the prison system that you're for mass incarceration, you might actually say, we need more prisons sort of like the European style prisons that are better. And I told a reporter one time, I can do it better. Just put a fence around a Motel 6 and let's give people some dignity. Let's give people a way to serve their time and try to rehabilitate themselves without completely ripping their lives apart and treating them like animals. I mean, there is I think, a pathway forward, but you're right. Looking at incentives in the system and who makes money off of that is very important thing to look at.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because what we're seeing here is the people who are incarcerated, they're being exploited by the state, the system per se, and when they get out, they're worse than what they were before. So that we're not even addressing recidivism. So when we're talking about criminal justice reform, we also had to talk about recidivism. How do we address that?
Yeah, recidivism is the number one thing. I mean, 5% of all or 60% of violent crime is committed by 5% of defendants in this country. So yeah, it's a major issue. The criminal justice system was never designed to do rehabilitation. We've convinced ourselves that it was during this era of mass incarceration. He's in prison, but he's being really rehabilitated, and we know better. We know better from years of research that lack of employment and stable housing is the #1 driver of criminality. And then I would add on to #3 would be mental health, substance use, and co-occurring disorders. So you've got a kind of a 1, 2, 3 that you got to address with people. And the other thing is people age out of crime. We forget about this too, that once you hit about 35, you're kind of done. You want to do other things. You want to make some money, you want to go do some other things, and you just get tired of it. And so we need to refocus the criminal justice system on what it is supposed to do and defocus it on what it's not supposed to do. And so I don't think putting people on probation and forcing them to go to treatment, all this kind of stuff, I think we've known for the last 40 years that doesn't work. We have to find a non-penal way, like outside of the criminal justice system, to help people. And that's one of the things I told some a legislator in California is if you want to make pretrial services work, make it services. We don't need another government dragnet to monitor people and assume that's going to help them, right? We need to give them the services that they actually need. That's what we need to focus on.
I totally agree. And the way that some people paint a picture of what prison's supposed to look like is a big fat lie. I've seen it time and time again when people get out of jail. You look at the news, you look at the newspapers, and we discover that this person has committed another crime. They become a habitual offender, and nothing has deterred this individual, for doing a crime. So he or she is back in jail for more time, maybe possible life, and it's by design to keep people in prison. Now, I don't know in other states, but I know here in Alabama, and I mentioned this before, probably several times, private prisons is a big business here. We got corporations right here in Alabama that are profiting and exploiting inmates, incarcerated individuals, here. And politicians are being paid off to keep this system going. It's just like you said it earlier, the system is set up for that individual to fail. Once they get into the prison system, they are set up to fail. I totally agree with that. Now, this also has some political ramifications, as well. People who either are elected to office or those who are either loyal to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. So, and I have several questions in regards to that. First question I want to ask is, what does the greater mix of Democratic and Republican lawmakers mean when we talk about criminal justice reform? And is it the same? Do they share the same philosophy? Do they share the same ideology?
Well, at this point, it's a game of Yahtzee. We might as well be throwing dice, my friend, because there's no way to know who is for what at this point. We know there's groups within the Democratic Party, but there's multiple groups. There's people who would say burn the whole system down, start over. There's people somewhere in the middle that we need to burn parts of it down and start over. And then there's sort of people over here in the Democratic Party that say we can, work across party lines, a la with the Trump administration, and pass what I would consider to be cookie cutter criminal justice reform that is criminal justice reform, perhaps in name only, that doesn't actually achieve anything significant. Similar to the Republican Party, you've got factions there. You've got sort of the far right group that say the system's fine. We need to even get harder on crime. And that's what we're seeing in places like Alabama, South Carolina, other states, Virginia, primarily in the South, that would say, let's expand the power of the government to do preventative detention and get rid of bail, and just say, we'll just lock everybody up. Then you've got sort of a group in the middle that says, that's a little bit too far. Perhaps, there's some room to do reforms. And then you've got sort of this centrist Republicans that are looking across the aisle to try to do something. I don't think anybody has thought through what fundamental change would look like. To me, it's just going back in time. I think what we've done is We've just built layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of different things over time and convinced ourselves that it works. And it doesn't. And so we could take all the money that we spend on all these programs that don't work and spend them on services and things that do work. And it's probably, like I said, it's going to be outside of the criminal justice system. But, I look at the reforms that have happened at the federal level and over the past couple of years, and I just think it's not good enough. I think we've got to refocus and figure out, one, we want to have low crime communities. I get all that. That's very, very important. But on the other hand, we got to break the cycle. And how do we do that? That's the number one question we've got to answer.
So when we're talking about criminal justice reform, one of the criticisms that a lot of people have with President Biden is that when he was a member of Congress, that he voted for I think it was the 1994 crime bill that was signed into law by President Clinton. And he served, I believe, in the, I don't know if it's a Senate or House of Representatives, but he was a member of Congress, at that time. And he voted for that criminal justice reform bill that was passed in 1994. And a lot of people said it done more harm, than good. And so when Biden ran for president, that kind of resurfaced somewhat. And now that we're seeing that a lot of African American men and women are being killed at the hands of the police departments across the country, we're beginning to again have a conversation about criminal justice reform. Some people say that, hey, we need to really look at police departments across the country. Some people say that it should be dismantled altogether. Some say that the police in its present form is beyond repair. So we're getting a lot of talk that is centering around these things I just mentioned. And it's definitely had become a political issue as well. Where do you see any of that going in the future?
Well, to talk about Biden himself, I mean, let's go back to 1984 in the Federal Bail Reform Act. At the time, we had a 24% pretrial incarceration rate, meaning 1 out of 4 people stay in jail pending trial. Biden voted for and supported the Federal Bail Reform Act of 1984, which eliminated bail, but it substituted it with a very harsh power of the prosecutor to lock people up. So where are we today? 3 out of 4 people are detained in the federal system without bail. They're just locked up. And so the federal system is a picture of a failure of mass incarceration policies that not only Joe Biden voted for, he was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in 1984 in the Senate that passed out this very bill. So it's been going on a long time. His counterpart, the vice president, when she was running for district attorney in San Francisco, and I have an audio recording of this, she spoke to a group of stakeholders and said, guess what? It's too cheap to commit crime in San Francisco. The bail schedule is too low. We need to jack up bails on all these guys because then they won't come to San Francisco to commit crime. And then she turns around 2 years later and runs on, she wants to get rid of bail. And it's like, well, wait a minute, I thought you were trying to increase bail. So, I don't think these 2 particular candidates have any credibility on this issue. They've been what we would call hedge hoppers. They've been on both sides of the issue, depending on which way the political winds blow. And that's just not good. I've been working on criminal justice for 20 years, and I try to stay consistent. I try to focus on civil rights. I try to focus on the government trammeling people's liberties and how can we strike this right balance. But these people, unfortunately, have based it on which way the political winds blow. And now that Biden has become president, all of a sudden he's a criminal justice reformer. But what has he done? What has he done? And the answer really, frankly, is nothing.
I totally agree with you on that. I have not seen anything significant that he has done to really address criminal justice reform. Also, there's a bill that's sitting on the George Floyd criminal justice reform bill that is still up in the air, that has not been even discussed in Congress. And then on the other flip side of the coin, you have a radical left group of Republicans just like you said, they say that the criminal justice system is fine. In fact, we're the party of law and order, which is a lie too. Because if you go back to January 6th, 2021, you know exactly where I'm going with that. You have all sorts of laws, that are being broken. This is the same type of group that says, we stand behind the police, we stand behind law enforcement. Yes, several law enforcement officers at the Capitol on that day was either harmed, hurt, or killed. So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy on both sides of the political spectrum. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, we want to hammer who we want to hammer, and we don't want to hammer who we don't want to hammer. And January 6th, the Federal Bail Reform Act of 1984, all of a sudden, Republican groups and groups on the right are mad that people aren't getting out on bail. All of a sudden, they want them to get out on bail. But they hadn't thought about that from 1984 till this January 6th period, when who were the people that were getting locked up? African Americans, largely due to the crack cocaine disparity of the 80s. I mean, these are the drivers of mass incarceration. And now all of a sudden it's outrageous. And denying bail and locking people up largely has been done in history due to political opponents. We want to lock up the political opponents. I mean, that was the history of bail. The king locked up 4 knights who didn't want to pay taxes to support the war. It had nothing to do with crime, right? And so that's what we have to look at. And it was surprising to me that, for all these years, then all of a sudden, you have people trying to overthrow the government, and it's outrageous that they don't have bail. Well, what about the person that was selling crack in the 1980s that spent their whole life in jail when their white counterpart selling cocaine did not? What about that? And where was the outrage then? And where is the outrage now? It just isn't there. And, it's the wrongfulness of the federal government's criminal justice policies from Biden's 1984 time period, really to the early Reagan years till now, needs to be undone. It's a civil rights atrocity by anybody's measurement.
So why is it when we talk about criminal justice reform, why it has to be such a divisive issue? Are there any common sense approaches that everyone can agree upon? And I understand some of the reasoning behind why this a divisive issue. Am I saying that some of what they're saying is right? No, I'm not. For example, profiting off of mass incarceration, is wrong, because we have to go back to the times of slavery when, when Africans was brought over to America, they were sold time and time again, and they was exploited for, their labor. And then they turn around and say, I work hard, for what I got. No, you have not. It is a lie. The folks back then had exploited African Americans for hundreds of years, and it's still going on now. That people today are benefiting for what happened in the past. It has not gone away. It just evolved itself. That's where the police came from. That's where law enforcement came from. Back in the day, they used to have debtors' prisons. If you can't pay your debt, you go to a penal colony. Georgia was a perfect example of how of a penal colony that was started in 1733. It was a place where people would go to have their debts, cleared. You aware of that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you look at, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI flooding African-American neighborhoods with drugs in the late 60s. And then all of a sudden we're going to start a drug war against them. And so you see what's going to happen. But the reason the criminal justice reform is slow or is difficult to happen is one guy, a guy by the name of Willie Horton. And we call it Willie Horton ads, from the Dukakis campaign, where, he let a guy out of prison on parole too early and was in a presidential primary, and it didn't go well. And so these putting people's faces and saying they committed these crimes and this is outrageous, it stirs public emotion. And the thing about it is the public doesn't understand. They don't understand, why the guy got out. Maybe he already paid his time. I mean, there's only limits to what the criminal justice system can do. How do we get something done? Right now it's really difficult. It's in fact, it's probably the most difficult time in my career working on criminal justice over the last 20 years, where I would say it's difficult to get something done. And I think the reason for that is everything has just become so politicized. And you look at policing reform, for example, I mean, that should be common sense, right? We don't want people to be beat up on the way to jail. We don't want people to be killed by the police. We want the police to do their job professionally and respectfully and get it done. And what's the real reason that we have, accidental police shootings and all this kind of stuff is that the training of police officers in this country is totally inadequate. It needs to be improved. We don't want to spend the money on it. I represented some police officers earlier in my career, and one of the experts we had said, your guy went to shoot, don't shoot training one time. And we expect him, we're going to send him into all these dangerous situations and hope that he gets it right. And maybe he will, and maybe he won't. But how much would it really cost to tighten down and professionalize policing and get more diversity in policing and all the things that we need to do to improve police? But, we just don't want to do it because we rely on the fact that we say, well, the criminals commit the crimes, they should pay for the system. And that's our first flaw in thinking. And that means we don't have enough money to do it right, unfortunately. So I think it's going to be really hard to get something done. I really do. And that's unfortunate because there's a lot that needs to be done.
As the issue of the increase of violent crime has been exaggerated.
In part, it has. I think you look at what's happened in New York, for example, on this bail reform issue, which we do think bail reform was a problem in New York the way it was laid out. I don't think anybody would argue with that. I think the polls show that the public thinks it dramatically increased crime, which is why you're seeing pressure on that. But the jury's sort of out as to what percentage that has caused. And I think what happens is we take extreme cases and we assume that's kind of what's going on. Now, is there an increase in violent crime? There appears to be. But is it some kind of a generational, monumental change that's happened? I'm not sure. I've looked at crime statistics going back, the 1980s and early 1990s was the highest crime period that we've had in this country. And we're certainly not back to that yet. And so I think perhaps we're overblowing it just a little bit here. I think it is a problem. I think it's worth looking at. I think, as I said, it's recidivism that causes it. It's not the people that get ensnared in the system. It's the 5% of defendants that commit 60% of the violent crimes. And everybody on both sides of the aisle can say, that's the population we need to target.
Do you think the media is kind of exaggerating this too?
I think so. I mean, it's great for ratings. It's great for ratings on both sides. It just is. And that's unfortunate. And I think the public, they like sensationalism, and as anybody in media would tell you, the bleed is the lead, right? And and you look at Fox News. I've never been on Fox News because I like to think I'm a little too reasonable for Fox News. I'm not sensationalistic enough to be on. I can't get on some of these far left shows either because I'm too moderate in terms of what we need to do. But it's unfortunate, but I think you're right. I think that is happening.
And I think they're really missing the point of what's really happening. And that they kind of like either scratch the surface or they don't want to touch it at all. Again, when somebody like me, for example, they would go and actually tell the truth of what happened. All of a sudden, I'm an enemy of the state. Why? Because I'm telling the truth. I'm telling the public what they need to know, and not this hoopla that we are getting in mainstream media. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I decided to go into podcasting, because I wanted to bring people on and I wanted to talk about the issues that people are talking about. Like, for example, people are talking on social media about criminal justice reform. They're talking about social justice. You never hear any of that in mainstream media, for example. You never hear about recidivism, in mainstream media. And so one of the reasons why I decided to go into podcasting is that these things need to be discussed. And we want to have a platform to where people can go on, and say, okay, this is the real deal. This is not what you're going to hear, on Fox News or NBC or wherever you want, whatever network that y'all enjoy watching. You're not going to get it on those stations. And so what happened is that people are turning I believe people are turning to podcasting more now than ever before because we are not afraid to talk about the issues that everyone else is talking about. And so when we talk about criminal justice reform, I don't think that mainstream media is really getting to the meat and potatoes of what it really is and what we need to do to actually have real criminal justice reform. As a matter of fact, when we talk about criminal justice reform, it's almost like a explicit word. It's like a curse word. Don't say that. Don't say criminal justice reform because people are going to be at your throat.
Yeah, I think you're right. Former Justice Louis Brandeis said electric light is the best disinfectant. And that's what your podcast is. It's a way to expose what's going on and disinfect the system. If people don't see what's going on, they will sit in their blindered world. It's like a horse blinker. You're just looking forward. You're not looking to the side. And that's what's happening. If you go on certain networks, your blinkers are going this way. If you go on certain networks, maybe your blinkers are going this way, but you don't see what's happening. And so I'm happy that you're doing this. And I think you're right. You need alternate voices to put out a narrative that is different than what is in the mainstream media, because it really is. Reporting has gotten so bad, from the days of the old time reporters where it truly was a search for the truth. We want to expose what's going on and waste, fraud, and abuse by the government. And I'm Scots Irish, so I can't claim to be, African American heritage, but we were anti-state, and the people that I come from do not trust the government. And I think that is the number one thing that we need to keep in mind, is that the government is here to serve the people, not the other way around. And when the government abuses its power and runs a bad system, that's on all of us to come fix it. So you're right. Electric light is the best disinfectant. And I would consider your podcast some version of that.
And another thing I want to point out too is the disparity of the people that are actually committing the crime. So we know right now that we have an opioid crisis. We have people that are being caught with distributing fentanyl and things of that nature. Now, we really want to put things in perspective. We have a lot of suburbs in America's largest city suburbs. There are they're crime. They're not only crime infested, they are drug infested. But you never hear anything about it, especially on the news. But when we're dealing with a predominantly African American population in certain areas, that's all we hear about. We see their mugshot on the news at least 3 or 4 times, throughout the day. Don't let it be an all news station. You probably gonna see that picture on the hour, every hour. Like in one suburb to where we are broadcast, the several suburbs where we are broadcasting from, the residents in those neighborhoods were saying that we are in the inner city, saying that borders these suburbs, that people take their drug activity over in our neighborhoods. And when we call, the police, all of a sudden we are in trouble. And I'm like, well, y'all didn't do it. So why are y'all being treated like criminals? So that's one of the things that we're dealing with here locally. I cannot say that it's happening, in other cities, but I'm quite sure that there are similar incidents to where certain areas are getting a pass with drug activity, um, and in certain places they are not. So the disparity in which people are being treated innocent until proven guilty is not always the case. Have you seen anything like that in your work?
Yeah, what I see is that the communities that have been disenfranchised due to the legacy of incidents and badges of slavery that still exists in this country have never been lifted up and are stuck in these neighborhoods. And we go, oh, that's just a bad neighborhood. And we throw our hands up and we think that the victims of those crimes somehow are not as important as the victims of crimes in the other neighborhoods. And I think that drives, how we police and how we handle these situations and what we think of this situation. We just say, well, these are just two gangsters in this neighborhood, so it's too bad. And so I think that needs to fundamentally change. But really what it comes down to be frank with you, is housing segregation. If you look at the history of housing segregation in this country, that's what causes it. Because we can label something a bad neighborhood. We can label something a black neighborhood. And if we didn't have housing segregation, we wouldn't be able to do that, right? Everybody would be treated more equally because we would just have a neighborhood. We would have a community that was inclusive. And so that is the number one way, I think, to solve that problem. And what the answer is to that, I don't know. I thought that, I've made the case for reparations a few barroom talks from time to time, but there has to be an answer, and as Dr. King said, when the slaves were freed, there was no 40 acres and a mule. In other words, they did not enter society post-slavery the way that we should. And we know all the history of that, from Plessy versus Ferguson all the way up to Brown v. Board, is that there was an intentional effort to disenfranchise African Americans in this country. And so something has to be done about that. If we can't fix that, we can always blame it on, well, it's just a bad neighborhood. Don't worry about it. Let it be. It's not worth it. And I think that's a major problem.
And so when we deal with that, when we label a neighborhood a bad neighborhood, I don't think a lot of people realize is that cities or people that label a neighborhood a bad neighborhood, they divest funding and resources for those particular areas, which means that you'll see less of a police and fire presence. Your infrastructure crumbles, and you'll have inadequate city services such as trash. I seen that happen, a lot. And let's not forget our homeless neighbors. When we have an increased homeless population, and I read several articles over the years, and what they do is that cities where they would bounce our homeless neighbors to different cities. So one example I can give is that I have talked to several homeless individuals in the last couple of years, and all of them told me that they are not originally from Birmingham. They come from all over the country, but yet they would pack them up in certain city. They would pack them up and then they'll sit them somewhere else. Just like what happened, I think it was in Arizona, when the governor there had bused a lot of immigrants over to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I mean, it's appalling. I mean, is this a game of pass the trash poker? I mean, come on, that's outrageous. But that's what communities do, unfortunately, because they've determined that it's cheaper to have somebody else fix the problem. And if we want to continue to pass the buck in this country, look what's going to happen. I mean, people are broken and we need to help them. That's what this comes down to. It doesn't matter what political side of the aisle you're on. We have broken people. We have people that are disenfranchised. We have people that live in segregated and inadequate housing. I mean, ask the people in Flint, Michigan, how the water is. I mean, we got to get on top of this. And it's completely irresponsible not to say that we have to fix this socioeconomic disparity. And the idea, as we said, that we can just say, this is bad neighborhood, so let's just throw our hands up and see what happens.
And can we say the same thing about criminal justice reform? Are we as Americans, are we really focusing on trying to fix the problem rather than just pointing the blame at whoever, and we never really get to hold ourselves accountable or someone else accountable? Like, who is the real culprit here?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the first African-American judge, female jurist to ever reach the Court of Appeals, Judge Amalia Curse, once said that the point of the criminal justice system is to prescribe what the crimes are and what the punishment is, and that's it. To go beyond that, is too much. And so what that means to me is that we're using the criminal justice system for things it wasn't designed to do. And we need to use other parts of the government or charities or whatever to solve the fundamental problems. We talk about like the immigration crisis, the root causes. We're not solving the root causes. We're not calling Nicaragua and saying, get your act together. We're not calling Honduras and saying, get your act together. We're not putting sanctions on them to increase their human rights. And we're not doing that in Detroit either, right? We're not doing that in the south side of Chicago either. We're not putting enough pressure on. And, maybe those people do want to get out of there. I'm okay with that. If somebody says, you know what, I want to move from the south side of Chicago to South Miami, because, I'd be on board with that myself. A little sun would be nice, but we're not giving people options, and it's just, unfortunately, it's all surface level. And right now it's all designed to win an election or to lose an election, not to advance the ball forward. And that should be the measure. Are we actually going to do something or not? And if we're not, let's just say we're not. Let's just say we're not. Let's just say we're for the status quo and we're not going to do anything other than just paying lip service to it, which seems to be what we're doing a lot of the time these days.
I totally agree with you. All I'm hearing is nothing but lip service. Everybody wants to be on TV, the newspapers, radio, behind the camera, behind the mic, saying, what I have done and what I'm going to do. But if I was to call someone and say, hey, I need you to do X, Y, and Z, all I'm hearing is every excuse in the world why I can't do it. By the time they say, oh, I want to do an interview. It's crazy.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah, I'm with.
absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's time for us to get serious. I think we've seen that. I think there's, mistrust of the system, and it's widespread, and it seems to be spreading. And so, somebody needs to step up and start doing something about that. So, for our little part of the world, we do what we can. We try to protect a core constitutional right. But you look at the ACLU, for example. And what I always say is, you ought to be drawing a line around the Bill of Rights and protecting that. But even in their case, sometimes it'll depend on politics. And we need to take politics, and you can probably agree with me, the more we can take politics out of American life, the better we can have a conversation about what actually needs to happen, and holding public officials accountable and saying, look, you're here to do something. You're not here to get elected and then go have fun. We're electing you to do something. And that's something we need to hold people accountable for and make sure that they're getting it done. They got to
I
be getting it done.
I totally agree with you on that. So, what reasonable balance can be achieved between ending the jailing of those charged with minor crimes versus protecting public safety from those posing a danger to society? 'Cause those are two different things.
Yeah, I think we need to focus on, as I said, the recidivist defendants. I think that's the game in criminal justice system. And I think, when you've gotten to your 10th crime, maybe there's something wrong. When you get in your 5th crime, maybe there's something wrong. So I think that's the entire game. And that's the entire way to look at this is we need to focus on the recidivist defendants. And then the other thing is we need to have crime deterrence policies that work. And like I said, that doesn't mean that we have to send you away for 30 years. It just means we have to catch you and tell you, hey, don't do that. And it doesn't have to be that big of a deal. It doesn't have to be, we're going to hammer all these people. But if we don't get into those two aspects, focusing on recidivists and then crime deterrence, what's going to end up happening is we're just going to overhammer everybody. And those are the bills that we're seeing in Virginia, for example. Let's deny bail to 65 different charges. That's what we're seeing in South Carolina. Let's give the power to judges and prosecutors to deny bail to anybody basically that they want and say, guess what? You'll spend the whole time in jail. We don't care. So that's what's happening. If we don't refocus, we're going to go too big. So I think a better balance can be created.
There's a similar bill in Alabama called Anaya's Law that was passed back in November when we had the primary election. And I said time and time again that you're going to have judges and prosecuting attorneys. They're going to misuse that law because basically that law says, okay, the judge can decide who's going to get bail and who does not. A month after that bill was passed, I found two cases to where judges had misused that law and say, okay, we basically will have the power to deny bail to anyone that we feel is a threat to society, even though they may not be. And it could be like a minor crime. And I looked at those two articles, that they had, and I was like, okay, I knew it. I knew that that you're going to have cases to where judges are going to misuse that law. And I was practically right. They
Yeah.
have, and people are not saying anything about it. So basically, the judges said, okay, ain't nobody saying anything about it. So we pretty much gonna get away with it. No, you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. It is that law that I just mentioned is similar to some of the laws that you have mentioned in Virginia, for example. It's basically a similar law with someone name attached to it. Now, to the family of Anaya Blanchard that was killed, I'm in no way being insensitive about that. It was very unfortunate of what happened here. But this law is not the answer. I think that there could be a stronger, more inclusive law that really deals with, the problem, you know, uh, for example, ending jailing of those who are charged with minor crimes versus protecting public safety from those who are posing a threat to society. I think that there is a better way, but having a law such as Anaya's law is not it. Because I have seen, I'm quite sure you have seen too, to where in many states, laws was passed that was, end up did not benefiting the public. Not only that, but it was misused by certain individuals, particularly judges and prosecuting attorneys. But again, you're not going to hear this in mainstream media. You heard it here first.
Yeah, and as Justice Thurgood Marshall would say, the shortcuts we take to convict the guilty only harm the innocent and ultimately ourselves. And that's what preventative detention is, like that law that you're referencing that we opposed, because you're giving the prosecutor a shortcut. You're giving the judge a shortcut to get to a conviction. And that's wrong.
Yeah, I was
That's
going to
not,
ask you
and as Thurgood Marshall said, that's consistent with the uses of tyranny and the police state to say that we can just lock you up and throw away the key without a conviction. And why did we do that? Because Fat Tony Salerno committed some crimes in New York and we wanted to lock up the mob. And we used that case to then say, now we can, lock up anybody we want in the federal system, which led to, mass incarceration, a generation of mass incarceration that hit African-American defendants the hardest. So that's the story, right? And that's why bad cases make bad laws, they say. And that's a perfect example of it.
So for the record and for the listening viewing audience, what is preventative detention?
Yeah, so in this country up till 1984, as we talked about, when Joe Biden was president of the Judiciary Committee at the time, the federal government decided we're going to have a special regulatory power where we can just say somebody's too dangerous and we need to keep them in jail. And what it was designed to do was hit the worst of the worst, the Charles Mansons, the people that if we let them out, we knew they would kill 12 people if we let them out right now. That's what it was designed to do. It's supposed to be in this little box over here. And like I said, at the time, the goal of it was to actually reduce the amount of pretrial incarceration, to target the more violent defendants. So we should have assumed over time that maybe pretrial incarceration would stay the same. But as I told you, it's gone from 24% when the law was passed to 75% of defendants today. And so that power was never thought constitutional. And Justice Thurgood Marshall's dissent in Salerno is one of the best dissents I've ever read. And he explains why. And really, it is because preventative detention will be used to lock up political opponents. It will be used for the wrong reasons. And ultimately, it will harm the innocent. And that's what we've seen, is that how many people go to jail pending trial and are ultimately exonerated because of these policies. In the federal system, it's so strong, the presumption, and the finger of the federal government is so strong that what ends up happening is people plead guilty even when they're not guilty. And so we say, well, we hate the cash bail system. And we say, well, that's great. And maybe we need to peel that back a little bit. But if you look at the alternative system that the ACLU, that Democrats have supported using algorithms to do all this over the last decade, is appalling. Like, go back in time to the 1984 hearings when the ACLU said, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. And here we have them in the 2010s saying we want to use an algorithm and preventative detention to lock up the people we don't like. And that's the solution to the encash bail problem. That's a civil rights atrocity, my friend. And that's what I was fighting and have been fighting, for the better part of 20 years.
So let's just say that I was protesting, doing civil disobedience or direct action in regards to police brutality. Uh, you mean to tell me that they? You mean to tell me that they can? You mean to tell me they can lock me up for that? Even though that is my constitutional right to do that. The reason why I ask is because several years ago, now recently, here in the state of Alabama, they was going to pass this so-called anti-protest law, to where I get involved in those type of activities. Not only will I get arrested, they're going to detain me for 48 hours with no bail, force me to plead guilty. I'll do jail time and I can no longer run for public office. That's what they tried to do here in the state of Alabama, but that law, their efforts had backfire. And we forced the mainstream media, to cover this, not only from the opponent's point of view, but from those who are against it. We had to force them to do that because we know that they was not going to do that because, as I mentioned before, the mainstream media, in my opinion, they're not fair and they're not balanced. They're not really interested in getting, both sides of the story. You said so yourself. This is sensational.
Yeah, I mean, I'd
They,
say
they,
that,
they have
most
they
states.
have they have an agenda that
Mhm.
also includes marking up the rate,
Well,
put it
prosecutors,
accomplishment.
I would say that if we give people the shortcut, they will take it. And that's, and so most times just disturbing the peace, you're not going to get, preventative detention, but you could get a bail. And you're right, you could sit there for a while before that bail is imposed. And you may not be able to post that bail. It may be too high and, you got to go to the Court of Appeals and all this stuff. And by the time all that time's over, you're in there longer than the original sentence, which is in some states we even see people sit in jail pending trial longer than if they pled guilty. So, there's all kinds of problems with this. And that, like I said, that bill in South Carolina would say, let's say you and I got into a bar fight and we both got a minor violent conviction. Well, now under this new bill, any new general sessions charge, which would be disturbing the peace, would be eligible for detention. So there are, states that are pushing the envelope. Indiana has a bill that says if you pose a threat to public safety, you can be detained on any crime. And that is outrageous thinking, but that is what we're seeing. And that is so abhorrent to the Bill of Rights that even the founding fathers would be turning in their graves right now.
But who determines, but who or what determines if a person is a danger to society or not? Who determines that?
The judge, but there's really no metric for that, right? I'm a danger to society because I'm here in New Orleans and I may be down at the parade tonight and somebody may piss me off and, we get in a duke out over it. So I pose a danger. I pose a danger when I walk out this door. Everybody poses a danger. And so that's the problem. And we can never predict what people are going to do. And as Judge Kerr said, we should base criminal justice on what free men and women have done, not what they may do in the future. And as Justice Marshall said, if we base it on what we do in the future, that's a shortcut. That's a shortcut we take to say, you're a bad person. You're a bad person and we're locking you up, rather than saying, we need to do something about this conduct. And that's where we've gone. That's where we've gone in this country is we go from, you're a good person, you're a bad person. You're a bad person, F you, that's our attitude. And that's so wrong.
There was even cases in Kentucky and in Georgia where there was an increased amount of arrests of African American individuals. And one police officer in Georgia, he got caught when he pulled over a white lady for a traffic violation. And the lady was like, well, no, don't shoot me, don't kill me. And he was like, well, no, we only kill black people. That was
Yeah,
on tape.
yeah, no, that's unfortunate. It really is. Um, and it's not good enough anymore. And I think, everybody's kind of starting to realize that, and hopefully, some real change can happen. But, until we put some spotlight on it, like you're trying to do here, I'm not optimistic, unfortunately.
And we have a case right now where Nichols, last name Nichols, I don't have the full story, but it sounds like to me that the officers that was involved shooting him was obviously in some kind of personal vendetta. I'm quite sure there is more to that story, but at the surface, that's where it appears to be. I never heard of a traffic stop ending up that violent on the part of the police. I can relate to that. I have a story on my own, to share with that. And, when that came up a couple of weeks ago, it really triggered because I could have been just like him. I could have been a George Floyd. I could have been a Breonna Taylor. I could have been any of those, individuals because it almost happened to me. I mean, if
Yeah, I
you don't
mean,
mind, I'd like to share that story. And I wanted to put it on record that about 8 years ago, while working at an Amazon fulfillment center, it was 3:30 in the morning. Obviously, it was like in the middle of the night, early in the morning. I worked a 12-hour shift. I was tired, ready to go home, when noticed that a county cop had ran me off the road, and he tried to make it seem like that I was trying to, run him over. Things got out of hand. They made me do all sorts of humiliating things. They told me if I even blinked, they was gonna kill me. It was the most humiliating thing I have ever went through. They made me take all kinds of sobriety tests, blood tests. They didn't find no drugs and no alcohol in my system. Yet they taunted me, they harassed me, they intimidated me, they put me in handcuffs, and they threw me in jail. Anyway. And I sat there for hours until I even, was able to get a trial. And then on top of that, they tried to bump up some false charges on me as well. They was getting ready to throw the book at me. So I was almost on the chopping block. And on top of that, they tried to throw me in jail. So that is what I went through. And I cannot tell you how painful that experience was. It was the most humiliating experience I have ever had. And for a very long time, I was afraid of even being around law enforcement because every time I see someone in a law enforcement uniform, it served as a trigger, to me. But now I am using this time to let people know what my story is. Again, I could have been a George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Tyree Nichols or any of these other individuals, but I survived. And I'm sometimes wondering why was my life spared? Considering I was sitting around 4 or 5, a handful of cops, and if even I would have blinked, I would have 20 or 30 bullets gazed in my chest. But yet I am here to tell the story.
well, it's horrible the way you went through them, and the trauma related to this. People don't who haven't been through it don't understand, and I've heard many a story like that. So I just encourage you to keep going, my friend, and try to you know continue to tell the story and continue to expose what's going on. That's the only way there's ever really going to be any change. And definitely thanks for having me on. It's been a good conversation over the last hour for sure.
And it makes me angry that you have people that are politicizing this issue, what is not even really a political issue. Of course, people think it's a political issue. If you never been through something like that, I don't expect people to understand and relate to them because they can't. For a long time, I thought that way until it really happened to me. And now I'm on the inside. I know what it's like. The only difference between those names I just mentioned is myself. I'm still here and they're dead. But the
Yeah.
experience is all too real.
Yeah.
I think it's
Well,
about time that I let people know, what my story is and that dealing with criminal justice reform is not good enough for me. It has to be something better than that. And until we have a conversation, about that, we're going to continue to have conversations like this. Very unfortunate.
I think you're right. It's been a good conversation today, though. So thanks again for having me, and I definitely appreciate it.
Okay. Yes, our time is definitely up here. Um, this is certainly not the last time that we're going to have a conversation about this because this need to be said. Things need to be called out, systems need to be called out, and definitely people need to be called out. Because again, it is not a good thing just to point these things out. We want to make sure that we have the right people because everybody, it's easy for me to blame someone. It's very easy to do that. But what can I do with my experience and my anger? How can I channel that to make sure that it does not happen to anyone else until we really have these policies change? That is what this is all about. And before we go, uh, you let everyone know how they can get in touch with you if they have any questions or they have an issue that they want to talk to you about.
Yeah, we're on ambailcoalition.org or hit us up on Twitter, same handle. And thanks again for having me on. It's been a good conversation.
And what would be your last word to the audience?
Well, I think people need to be vigilant about criminal justice reform and try to cut through all the politics and try to find real solutions to the problems and listen to people's story. Listen to each other a little bit. It goes a long way.
Thank you so much for being part of the show today.
Thank
I
you.
hope it was informative to everyone, and thank you for the work that you have done in the past. And I wish you well on your future endeavors.
You as well. Thank you. Have a great day.
And this is Keith Williams from OBS Talk Show Presents. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.